I'm at Umeå University at the Applied Educational Science Department as a postdoc. But I am from Vasa, Finland, and the studies that I will talk about is basically done in Finland, in this Swedish parts of Finland. So anyway, I'm going to talk about what I call design-based epistemic meta-reflection, and kind of define it as a key to evolving digital didactical design. And I'm going to tell you about a few studies that have kind of brought me to this position, and I would be very glad to get your feedback on that afterwards and what you think about it. But the hypothesis, because as I wrote in the abstract, what if it does not make much difference how we teach and the methods we choose, as long as we do not talk about how we learn. And during my, if I count, maybe 18 years of research in this area, you probably also heard about the insignificant difference phenomenon, where they have compared different methods and media to see which is best for learning. And there is always this insignificant difference phenomenon. Some studies say, well, this is worse, this is bad, but I think it's not as much about the methods as it is about how we talk about learning as such in relation to the methods. And that's brings me to the next slide. And I'm supported by Roger Selye, who says that meta-learning in relation to educational technology is one of the most important socializing practices of modern education, and is something that teachers have to prioritize in the digital didactical designs. I call this meta-learning 2.0 because it's learning to learn with and for digital tools for the purpose of learning and becoming expert learners, that is. A short story about myself, how I experienced firsthand that the context in a learning situation is very important. I lived in India for a few years, and I was learning Indian classical dance, and it's very intricate movements, jumps and turns and coordinations, and it's heavily, for the memory it's very, difficult, and you have to synchronize a lot of things. And I realized that when I moved, I trained at home in our apartment, where it was sort of narrow between the walls, and the teacher would sit on the floor and beat a wooden stick on a wooden block and give me the beats, and I would jump and turn and blah blah blah. And then when I moved to a bigger hall, I realized that the movements I used to know, I didn't anymore. And I noticed that I had learned them in relations to the walls, and how far I should jump, and remember the turns in relation to how the walls were framing my dance situation, so to speak. And after that, I've also read a lot of studies about, how context is important for memory, but for learning as such. So I take this as a metaphor for understanding firsthand how important context is for learning something. And in a digital environment, I call this then the design-based epistemic meta-reflection, which is a really, really bad term because it's too long and it's too complicated. But I'll try to explain what I mean by it, and maybe you can give me a better term to use, but this is it. And the design-based, of course, refers to being aware of both affordances and constraints of the design and the tools being used. And the epistemic is about your own awareness of the knowledge creation process, so that you can see the knowledge creation, but you can also understand it. And the meta-reflection is about your own awareness of your own reflection and the ability to see more than one perspective, and how you can reflect then from different perspectives on this epistemic knowledge creation process. And this is key to self-regulation, as I see it, because it's about becoming empowered and having agency to control and monitor your own learning process in relation to the tools and the context. And an example of this, last year I was teaching a didactics course for university teachers, and I tried this with exercises to see how they could discuss their own learning. And it was like a blended design with face-to-face meetings, Moodle, and online material and literature. And the objectives of the course was, I for one wanted to see how online videos could be used for teaching. Like I could combine what was already out there, so I didn't have to design or make everything on my own, and how I could combine that with forum discussions and collaborative writing in wikis, for instance, so to optimize and make learning efficient and effective. And for this, then I wanted them, another objective, them to become aware of their own learning process, discuss their own learning process, and understand that in relation to theories that we were talking about, but also then to practice this design-based epistemic metareflection in relation to digital and social context. And the third objective was to teach them about action research as a method for course development. Since this was university teachers, I wanted them to understand how they could use research approach to develop their own teaching. So I did this by having 3 variations of design, didactical design, and I varied timing, group size, strategies for collaborating, strategies for writing, discussing, summarizing, etc. And between these, we discussed the learning process and how it changed and how they reflected on their learning in relation to this variation. So this was an example. Another example I heard when I was at a conference, and I heard the researcher Annika Ageli-Genlot, who talked about a research she had in elementary school where they were teaching young students, about maybe 9 or 10 years old, to use Google Documents for writing and giving feedback to each other. And she had a video that she showed, and I was very impressed by this video because the students were talking about their own learning process using terminology that I would say maybe a researcher would use or so. So I just had to ask her that how come these students are so developed in their discussing and talking about their own learning. And she said that, well, that has been a long process, and we have really worked to give them the terminology to discuss their own learning. And these 10-year-olds were discussing, you know, how feedback would enhance their learning, and how they went into details to discuss when she gave me this feedback, I saw myself blah blah blah. So this was a process that I would say this is very much a design-based epistemic meta-reflection, that they had given that tool to the students to kind of make their own learning visible and give them the terminology to discuss it. By this I come to the research of John Hattie. He's from New Zealand, I believe, and he's written this book about visible learning. And he has done a meta-study on meta-studies. So he has some 250,000 data points or something like that. And he compares everything research on education in order to see what impacts learning the most. And he says like this: when students know where they are at, where they are going, and what their next steps are, they are developing the capabilities of visible learners. And visible learners are students whose skills also include self-regulation and who seek and are resilient to and aspire to challenges. I have focused a lot of my research on design for self-regulation. That was my question for my doctoral thesis, for instance, how to design for self-regulation, where the learning design is meeting the needs of the learner, and how you can support this self-regulation process through different design strategies. Researching self-regulation, you look at how somebody's doing something and why somebody's doing something in relation to what and where, that is content and context. And for my thesis, I looked at behavior, cognition, affect, motivation in relation to 2 different iterations of the same course. So I had iteration 1 and iteration 2 of a corporate e-learning course that I looked at. And for this research, I used different methods, and I later found out that there are actually 3 waves of research methods for self-regulated learning, and I've used all of them. And the first generation was where they looked at self-regulated learning as something static and fixed, and hence they thought that you can measure it afterwards by using questionnaires, and you would get all the self-regulated learning process from that, because they thought that the people can afterwards kind of make that judgment in a real way. Well, then they found out, no, you won't get all the answers because it's not static, it's a dynamic process, and it's also always in relation to the context and the choices you make for learning. So then I've also used, which you can see in the second picture here, like eye tracking methodology, where you can see how people view the screen and the choices they make. And what I did myself for my thesis was to use a video stimulated recall interview, where we looked at the recorded material of their working process and then discussed their learning process in relation to this. I found 3 types of self-regulated learning, which I call instruction-directed navigation and self-directed manipulation, and then third, feedback-directed exploration. And the third is actually the one that I found in the second iteration, because the first iteration hardly had any feedback to the students at all. And when we incorporated feedback, they started to explore the environment on the terms with the goal of finding their own empty spaces which they were filling for, so they could define their empty spaces that they needed to fill in order to pass the test. Well, while the self-directed manipulators, for instance, they more directed their actions towards manipulating the environment in order to pass the test in any way. For instance, memorizing multiple choice questions, not the content, but how the X's were, placed on the screen, for instance. So feedback is very important, but that we know already. But with feedback, you can change how people regulate in relation to the context. From looking at this, I got really interested in the process of this, what's called the third wave of self-regulated learning research, where the researcher actually is a part of the process in discussing the learning and creating this meta-reflection in order to evolve the learning for the learner, so to speak. And this happens sort of naturally when you look at something that has been recorded and you as a learner have never seen that before, and you sort of realize, wow, that's me learning. Why did I do like that? And then you start the process. So you get the tools for kind of reflecting very directly on the choices you have made for learning, and kind of start that evolving process of looking at yourself as a learner in new ways. In this corporate study, the learners, since it was like an independent self-paced course, a lot of them were talking about the need for social feedback, for instance, and the need for being able to negotiate meaning of the content, that it's not maybe a set answer. It's more about problems that are messy, that you have to negotiate the meaning in the best possible way with other people in order to know how to solve them, for instance. I started to look at learner needs in a much broader sense, and how can we design for these broader needs in a digital environment. And I stumbled upon researcher Kim, who had looked at Maslow's hierarchical needs but put it in the context of manifestations in an online environment. And another researcher, Bishop, when he looked at this and to see how are these needs prioritized in terms of how they are most important, he looked at them and found that in a networked learning environment, social interaction is by far the most important factor that motivates participation. And this was in regard to the activities that had been used in his study. And I can agree with this, that the social interaction is very, very important to design for. Since I've been looking at distance courses a lot, I also stumbled upon this theory of social presence. And Garrison and his colleague, they defined it as the ability of participants in a community of inquiry to project themselves socially and emotionally as real people, that is their full personality, through the medium of communication being used. And this is something that I find very interesting and very important for distance education. And another study that I did on higher education courses, this was a course in master's studies in energy technology here in Vasa, and they had combining distance and co-located students for saving money, for teaching subjects in 2 locations at the same time. And the problems that I found was that there were very much unequal roles between the student groups, and other problems were that lack of nonverbal cues made it impossible for the teachers to read the needs of these distance students. And in other words, social presence was lacking totally. I looked at this from the perspective of usability, and I saw this as different dimensions of usability of a learning design, where you can see the technical usability as one, you can see the pedagogical usability relating to, for instance, how you design content and how you scaffold and visualize learning. And then social usability is more about how you design and are able to create this social presence, so people can collaborate, they can communicate and feel part of a community of inquiry. And then the meta-reflective usability is all about creating opportunities for meta-learning, learning about how you become a better learner in that environment. And I did in this study, I looked at both students and teachers, so collegial usability was another aspect that the teachers really needed support from other teachers in the same situation. And this was not the fact. They were mostly on their own without any support to discuss their didactical development. So a lot of things to do here, I believe. For instance, from this study, conclusions drawn was that for the sociability, for instance, you could add routines for collaboration, routines for supervision, try to make equality among the students and create positive attitudes, because between these groups there were a lot of we and them kind of separation, that we don't want to include them and we'll like that. So that was a big issue because they didn't share and collaborate. This was a problem when they were collaborating during tasks, for instance. And try to create authentic meetings and relationships, and do everything you can to lower thresholds for asking questions, for instance, because this is important to be included in the discussion. And of course, then the meta-reflective usability to talk about learning and learning strategies and practice this design-based epistemic meta-reflection. I was doing another study on distance teachers in upper secondary school, and based on my prior knowledge and how difficult it is to create this social presence, I started to think about, well, what is it? What do you need to be able to do this? And I came across Jonas Aspelin, who's writing about relational competence, and he's talking about this as the ability to be socially interactive, have emotional communication, be able to create dialogues, personal development, and personal connection. And Rimmen Kaufman and her colleagues, they said that keys to being relationally competent is the ability to be sensitive for somebody's needs, but also the ability to be responsive to the needs that you encounter. I use this as a frame for analyzing data for interviews with teachers that had all at the same as the last study, combined then both distance students and these co-located students, and how they were both anticipative, sensitive and responsive to learner needs, which related to then emotional needs, cognitive epistemic needs, metareflective needs, self-regulatory needs, social needs, and practical logistic needs. So what I found were a lot of thresholds for how teachers were able to create authentic interactions in this teaching situation. For instance, there was the whole frame of it made it less teachers able to be less spontaneous. For instance, they had to be more strict in how they designed the course and know exactly what they're going to say and where and when, and couldn't kind of add things in for as a spontaneous thing. And there was a lot of problems with orchestration overload, that, you know, combining technology to groups, the content, and having everything kind of balls in the air, so to speak, and that was a big problem. They also had shorter lectures due to logistical problems between the schools, and they needed more effort for content planning and editing because of the technological solutions. And there were less times for discussions and interactions because of that. And a lot of students had lack of proper equipment for one, and that was, of course, a big problem. And but from a relational perspective, I found it very problematic that I could see that there were no prior norms in how to relate or connect between the groups, and for the teacher to sort of orchestrate these relational aspects on top of everything else that the teacher had to do was kind of overwhelming. As an example, I have two excerpts from interviews. For instance, how uncomfortable for co-located students it was. The teacher said, "Sometimes I place the face-to-face students around a table so that everyone could be seen by the distance students, but well, they weren't comfortable to be on camera. So the situation wasn't comfortable for the co-located students. And then for the distance students, it created inequality. And another teacher says like this: "It is easier for face-to-face students to ask questions. It is a bigger step for someone at a distance, partly because they don't really know who is listening to them in class. Is it perhaps 30 students? This is perhaps creating a higher threshold, and you feel that you have to have a really good question in order to ask something." So this teacher is kind of describing that the situation in itself was kind of felt unsafe for the students. And this brought me to the concept of psychological safety, which I find is very interesting in this context. And I only found they talked about it in workplaces, which I think is kind of weird, but maybe I haven't found the right literature yet, but perhaps you can give me some suggestions. But this Amy Edmondson, she defined psychological safety as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And of course, this is very important in a learning situation, that you are able to feel safe to fail without feeling humiliated in front of people that are somewhere at another space and you don't really know who they are. the same Amy Edmondson, she suggests leadership for creating psychological safety, and this is of course then for workplaces and group teamwork. She said like this: define the task as a learning experience and welcome uncertainty, highlight interdependence, scaffold collaboration, model curiosity, and acknowledge your own fallibility, that as a leader acknowledge that you can also fail and it's okay to fail. So conclusions from all these studies: conclusion 1, for as an aim for digital didactical design, I would say designing for social interaction while maintaining psychological safety, and this is a very important key. And conclusion 2 would be to design for metalearning 2.0, that is empowering students with agency for design-based epistemic meta-reflection. And I go back to Hattie and his meta-study on meta-studies, and his list of what the best teachers do is to create good relations with students. So that's all in line with what I've experienced as well. And scaffold students in using varied learning strategies, and willingly explain content, and then they are engaged in students' learning processes, so they see the learning as a process as such. And you probably also heard about Carol Dweck, who talks about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, and she has the same idea about this thing: focus on what hinders comprehension and discuss new strategies to try out, and have a positive attitude towards failing, create a learning culture for psychological safety. And she says that this is the number 1 key to kind of create in a learning culture. On to the ongoing study that I'm involved in together with Peter Bergström and Eva Morell Olsson, among others, is a study on teaching with tablets, and they've collected a lot of data in 3 Nordic countries. And a lot of analyses are going on in relation to these data. I'm going to focus on comparing Sweden and Finland, and I would like to look at the classroom observations in relation to what I've talked about now. And the research questions you can see relate to both what Hattie said and Carol Dweck said these last slides. For instance, digital relational competence research questions that I'm interested in is: how do teachers create psychological safety while using iPads in the classroom? So these observations then are sort of like, you can see, you shadow the teacher to see how are they doing this in various ways, and what can we learn about that. And the second question: how do teachers foster good relations while using iPads in the classroom? And then for metalearning 2.0, how do teachers scaffold a variety of learning strategies? And how do teachers engage in students' learning processes while implementing iPads? So these are questions I aim to look at in relation to these data and compare them the Finland and the Swedish data. And the research aim is to learn more about how teachers and students can develop their competencies for teaching and learning with digital tools, how teachers together with the students can reflect on, for instance, what is the objective of the didactical design, why certain tools are chosen to support learning, and how it impacts learning. This goes back to teachers' competencies, then how they can design for digital didactical design. And you can break this down then to the digital competence, the didactical competence, relational competence, but also the competence for design-based epistemic meta-reflection. And this is a way then to evolve learners. And John Hattie said, from his meta-studies of meta-studies, he said, the most remarkable feature of the evidence is that the greatest effects on student learning occur when teachers become learners of their own teaching and when students become their own teachers. So with this, he said, I see that he is trying to say that that we have to view learning and the teaching process as like a meta-learning experience in itself, and in that sense evolve as learners. I end with this picture and Marshall McLuhan's text when he said that we drive into the future using only our rearview mirror, and I find this a very nice metaphor still for using digital tools and media for learning and for our lives, for living, as we can only know afterwards how it impacted our learning and the whole situation. That's why I think action research, for instance, is very important for teachers, so they can become the observers of their own development as teachers and as learners. So I end by that. Thank you very much. I hope you have a lot of comments and feedback and can want to discuss this now. Thanks.